Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Omni viewer. Just a reminder, the reason I'm here instead of in my usual studio is because I have a minor back injury I'm recovering from. I can't stand for a long time, so I'm sitting to do some of these videos henceforth, at least until I'm better. But anyway, that's all beside the point. I'm here today to continue talking about Looney Tunes because you may have noticed that there was a pretty big thing that happened over the week that I was absent for. Right as The Day the Earth Blew Up debuted in theaters, it was announced that all the classic Looney Tunes shorts from Max were gone. New Looney Tunes content still remains on there, at least as much as there was of it, but the classic Looney Tunes material, it's gone. And this is after a lot of other animated stuff was dropped from Max. A bunch of their Cartoon Network titles, the original Teen Titans, things like that. The Warner Brothers war on animation continues. And naturally, it's got a lot of people fired up, right? I mean, why wouldn't it? Now, of course, if you have physical copies of Looney Tunes, it might not affect you that much, but all the same, this is kind of disrespectful, right? It's the principle of the thing. Well, the thing is, I do think this is a bad choice, and it is just the latest in a long string of decisions made that make it very clear that Time Warner, well, AT&T Time Warner, under its current ownership, is no place for animation. It just seems like anything animated is at risk, except for Jellystone for some reason. They just dropped a whole bunch of new episodes. Not that I'm complaining, I like Jellystone, but anyway, fact of the matter is, animation just seems to be persona non grata at Warner Brothers right now. And I do think that's a bad decision, but I also have to say that I am not the least bit surprised. Because, well, this sort of thing has happened before. Pretty much from the beginning, Warner Brothers has had a very rocky relationship with its animation department. I actually am thinking back to a joke from an early episode of Animaniacs where the Warner Brothers crashed this big studio party. And of course, with all the gag celebrity appearances there, they run into Michelle Pfeiffer in complete Catwoman costume and introduce themselves with their classic, "We're the Warner Brothers." Michelle Pfeiffer says, "Oh, like the studio?" And Yakko says, "Not really, but we don't have a choice." I kind of feel like if the Looney Tunes had a say in it themselves, that's how they would feel about Warner Brothers. And they would have felt that way from the start. You see, back in Hollywood's golden age, the place you went for animation was largely Disney. Every studio had an animation department in some capacity, but Disney was the studio built on animation, and that was by design. Walt Disney wanted to prove that animation was a truly legitimate art form, not just good for little comedic shorts, but for telling actual highbrow epic stories. And he arguably did prove that. To this day, when people think of Disney, they think of mostly, well, they might think of Marvel these days, but they still largely think of animation first. So that was true back then as well. They did a couple live action things, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Treasure Island, things like that, but they were mostly known for Cinderella, Pinocchio, Snow White, Dumbo. Warner Brothers was different. Warner Brothers, like other studios, was built on live action. So that was their main draw. And animation, while that was part of it, wasn't necessarily prioritized. The building that the animation department worked out of was called Termite Terrace for a reason, because it was the worst building on the lot. It was small, cramped, run down, actually termite infested, hence the name. Yeah, it was not the sort of place that you would want to work if you were working at a big studio, but it didn't stop anybody there from making some really great cartoons. I'm sure we can all agree. And that went strong for a while until the mid 60s. At which point, after an unsuccessful jump to television that saw a decrease in animation quality and a small batch of new characters that nobody really liked, with the one exception being Cool Cat, and even he only survives kind of in an ironic way. After that, Warner Brothers decided to just shut the animation department down completely. That is the truth. It was shut down. The animators, the directors, the voice actors, they were all just sort of scattered to the wind. The characters existed only to be licensed out for cereal commercials or every once in a while in somebody else's cartoon. If you want to see one of the real low points of the Looney Tunes history, look up the Looney Tunes crossover with the Groovy Ghoulies. You can actually find it right here on YouTube. It's painful. So that's the way it was for a while. For a long stretch of time, and it certainly felt long to the fans, let me tell you, Warner Brothers did not bother with animation, period. Now, it's not that nothing good came out of that situation. I mean, after all, it allowed Friz Freleng to go to MGM and develop the Pink Panther into something that would survive beyond the opening credits of the comedy movie series. Chuck Jones did some of his best artistic animation in that period, like adapting the works of Rudyard Kipling or things like A Cricket in Times Square, things like that. But otherwise, Warner was just done with animation. So the 60s weren't the best time for Looney Tunes. But the cartoons were still being run on that amazing new medium known as television. And by the time we got to the mid 70s, Warner Brothers noticed something. The new top brass in the studio found out that the Looney Tunes actually had a devoted fan base, a really passionate one that spanned generations. And that got them to think maybe we should bring the animation department back. And they did. And that's where we got certain things like the compilation movies that were released theatrically and some new TV specials, one of which is my personal favorite, Bugs and Daffy's Carnival of the Animals. That remains one of my favorites to this day, in fact. They would, of course, farm out the Looney Tunes to appear in somebody else's movie at another studio, only that time it was for Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which people loved. So I guess that gets a pass. So animation was back, and even though Mel Blanc sadly passed away at the very end of the 80s, that didn't mean Warner Brothers was done with animation. Although we would learn that they still didn't quite know what to do. As we entered the 90s, we of course had the animation renaissance. Some people simply refer to it as the Disney Renaissance because Disney was knocking it out of the park with both movies and TV shows. But it was really a general renaissance of animation as a medium, where everybody was going the extra mile, it seemed. And like I said, Disney had it pretty solid in as many mediums as they could. Warner Brothers was killing it on television, of course, because, you had Tiny Toon Adventures, Batman the Animated Series, Animaniacs, Pinky and the Brain, and the like. But when it came to movies, well, obviously they were going to try their hand at movies, but we had some problems. They did release a successful Looney Tunes movie in that decade, which was Space Jam. Even though it wasn't a very good movie, it was the only successful one they had. Now, something like Quest for Camelot, obviously, that's a clunker. It was probably never going to do well. But they also released some real masterpieces at the time. Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which was connected to their successful animated series. Cats Don't Dance, The Iron Giant. Masterpieces of cinema, but also box office bombs. Why, if they were so good? Well, there are a whole bunch of factors. I think a large chunk of it comes down to marketing. The 90s was the age of being hip and cool and radical. And when you got a movie that has the world's most famous basketball player playing basketball with the Looney Tunes, that practically sells itself to kids. Which, that was another thing. Even though it was a renaissance of animation and these animated works were among some of the best ever conceived, stuff that could be enjoyed by anybody, there was still that perception of cartoons as a child's medium. So, how do you market stuff like those other three movies to kids? Well, it's not that there isn't a way, but Warner Brothers didn't really know how to do it. I can understand them being a little gun shy with Mask of the Phantasm because Batman Returns had gotten a lot of flack for being too dark and violent and horrifying. So having another Batman movie come along that was not quite in that direction, but certainly went further than most animated movies would. Yeah, of course, they were going to be a little bit hesitant with that one and not know how to properly market it. It should have just been marketed to Batman fans, quite frankly. And the Batman fans would have spread the positive word of mouth and history would have done the rest. Didn't work out that way. For something like Cats Don't Dance and the Iron Giant, though, they also had the something going against them in that while they were solid movies, they were also period pieces. And like I said, the 90s was all about being hip and rad and cool. And that's the way you marketed something to children. How do you do that with something that's essentially a tribute to 1940s musical movies and a Cold War era thriller? It's not going to be easy. They should have been marketed differently, of course, but they weren't, so they tanked. And there are probably other factors as well, but it all just goes to show you that Warner Brothers didn't quite figure out the whole theatrical animation thing. To be fair, though, Disney did have a leg up on them because they built that reputation over the years. Just seeing the Disney logo told people it was probably worth going to no matter what. Warner Brothers hadn't quite proven themselves in that department by the 90s. But like I said, they were doing pretty good on TV, and they would eventually go the next step by launching Cartoon Network, which not only became a haven for the classic stuff, both their original Warner Brothers, Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, as well as the recently acquired Hanna-Barbera cartoons, but it would also see a whole bunch of new cartoons come along, some of which revolutionized the very medium itself in a brand new way. And moving into the 2000s, they did start to take a few other chances with animated movies. For example, they said, the Powerpuff Girls sure is doing well on Cartoon Network. Let's do a theatrical Powerpuff Girls movie. And we did plan some Space Jam sequels, didn't we? Because Space Jam was successful. So dust off that Spy Jam one and hand it to that Dante's Inferno guy or whatever, and let him do something with it. The results were the Powerpuff Girls movie and Looney Tunes Back in Action, both of which are good, but again, both of them flopped really hard. In fact, the flopping was so bad that Warner Brothers would basically abandon theatrical animation until 2014. Like 2003 was when Back in Action was released, and it bombed so hard that there was nothing else until 2014 when they did the Lego movie. And the Lego movie, of course, was a hit, and everybody likes that. And it's a good movie to boot. Although their attempts to make it a cinematic universe unto itself didn't really last all that long. Longer than the Dark Universe did, but still wasn't much to it after that. so Warner Brothers was back in the realm of animation, although they hadn't really done any other animated stuff in theaters since the Lego movies. As for TV, like I said, they had Cartoon Network going. They remained pretty steady, greenlighting new projects every couple of years or so. Although even then, there was that brief period where it looked like Cartoon Network was going to experience network rot by suddenly having a bunch of live action material, because that's what you tune into Cartoon Network for, although now it was just CN, you may recall. Thankfully, clearer heads prevailed and that era was left behind. But it was touch and go there for a while. But then, of course, we got to the era of streaming. HBO Max was launched, which is what it was called before it became just Max. And that brought with it a whole bunch of new animation, the aforementioned Jellystone, as well as Looney Tunes cartoons and other things. That's where all the DC animation went, a bunch of the Cartoon Network animation, all that stuff. And it seemed like, considering Looney Tunes cartoons not only looked amazing, but was also one of the primary selling points for why you ought to subscribe to Max, at least according to the people making the commercials, it looked like there was going to be a new uptick in animation on the Warner Brothers department. Then, of course, Space Jam: A New Legacy happened, and that was a disaster on just about every level. And as things started to look financially dire for Time Warner, that's when the AT&T merger happened. David Zaslav was put in control. He started axing animated projects left, right, and center. And it's all culminated in this most recent bit of news. So I'm just bringing this up to point out that, yes, this is horrible, but it's happened before. In fact, it seems cyclical. I think that would be the appropriate term. Now, if there's any good news I can offer in regards to this, it would be that since it is cyclical and the wheel has historically just kept on turning over the years, that means we shouldn't give up hope. If the wheel continues to turn, then at some point, Warner Brothers will realize that animation is more important to its identity than it would want to believe. The fans already know it, of course, but the studio will realize it, and they'll get back on track. I wish I could tell you how long that's going to take or what needs to happen in order for it to start, but I can't do that. All I can tell you is that, historically speaking, this has happened before, it's happening now, and the Looney Tunes always come back. In fact, when they come back, sometimes they're even better than they were before. Let's just hope. I mean, it seems that Catch-Up Entertainment is now starting to save certain Looney Tunes projects. The Day the Earth Blew Up maybe isn't exactly blowing up in theaters as far as I can tell. Like, I thought it was going to pass the $15 million mark much easier than it seems to be, but it's still getting a good reception. So now they're in talks to rescue Coyote versus Acme. And if that works out, who knows? Maybe that's what it'll take to get the ball rolling again. I don't have all the answers. I just wanted to let you guys know that what's going on here is nothing new. Time marches on, but history repeats itself. And hopefully it will repeat itself in the other way, the way in which fans will finally get to see the Looney Tunes come back to their former glory. We just have to endure the dark times until that happens. So until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.